What if your husband gave you the kind of birthday gift that made you moan his name, while another man kissed your thighs? What if your weekend in the woods turned into a wild, breathless journey of being worshipped by two men at once? This is not just another steamy story. This is the kind of story that makes your skin burn, your heart race, and your body ache for more. If you've ever fantasized about letting go, about surrendering to pleasure without guilt, then darling, you're exactly where you need to be. Hit that subscribe button now. Because the stories I tell, they don't just make you listen, they make you feel. The early October air was crisp, carrying that familiar scent of fallen leaves and pine. Sarah rolled down the car window slightly, letting the cool wind tousle her hair as Mark drove them up the winding mountain road. It had been years since they'd taken a weekend for themselves. No phone calls, no emails, no grown kids needing favors. Just the two of them, alone in a cabin tucked deep in the woods of Colorado. At least, that's what she thought. "I still can't believe you planned all this," Sarah said, her voice warm with gratitude, as she looked over at her husband. No anniversaries, no birthdays, just us. Mark smiled, one hand on the steering wheel, the other reaching for hers. "We needed this. You needed this." She squeezed his hand gently, grateful for his attention lately. For months she had felt a shift, not in love, but in routine. Life had gotten quiet, predictable, safe. She had begun to wonder if desire had faded into comfort, if passion was something you only rediscovered in dreams. The cabin appeared suddenly through the trees, its dark wood exterior and smoke curling from the chimney, looking like something out of a postcard. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. "Mark, it's beautiful." "I'm glad you think so," he said, parking the car and cutting the engine. "Go inside. I'll grab the bags." She stepped out, boots crunching on gravel, and walked up the wooden steps to the front porch. The door was unlocked, and as she pushed it open, a wave of warm cedar-scented air wrapped around her like a blanket. Inside, the cabin was cozy. Stone fireplace, worn leather furniture, shelves filled with books and old records. Candles had been lit. Wine glasses were already on the counter. And then she heard it, the faint sound of a man's voice from the hallway. She turned quickly, and there he was, Eli, Mark's best friend from college, the kind of man who never aged the way most men did. Rugged, silver-streaked hair, those easy eyes that always held a trace of mischief. She hadn't seen him in nearly 2 years. Last she heard, he had moved back from the East Coast after his divorce. "Sarah," he said with a warm smile, stepping out of the hallway with a towel draped around his neck. "Didn't think I'd be the surprise, did you?" Her mouth opened slightly. "Eli, I thought this was just a getaway for the two of us." Mark entered behind her, setting the bags down with a soft thud. "It is," he said smoothly. "But Eli's been going through a rough patch, and I figured maybe a little company wouldn't hurt. We haven't all been in the same place in years." Sarah looked between them, her heart fluttering in a strange rhythm. Part of her was surprised, but another part, deeper and quieter, couldn't ignore the energy that had just shifted in the room. Eli's gaze wasn't casual, and neither, she noticed, was the way Mark looked at her in that moment, like he was watching her reaction closely. "Well," she said, trying to compose herself, "the more, the merrier." Eli laughed, low and easy. "I brought the bourbon." That night, after a hearty dinner and a few glasses of wine by the fire, the three of them laughed like they hadn't in years. The cabin glowed with warmth, and the outside world felt miles away. Sarah sat nestled between the two men on the couch, her shoulder brushing Eli's, her hand resting on Mark's thigh. And at some point during a lull in the conversation, she realized something. She wasn't cold anymore. But it wasn't just the fire. Later that evening, the wind had picked up outside, whispering through the tall pines like an ancient lullaby. Inside the cabin, the fire had died down to a quiet glow, and the last of the wine sat in their glasses, untouched. The three of them were no longer talking, just sitting in a gentle silence that felt heavier than before. Charged, a silence that wasn't quite empty. Sarah shifted slightly on the couch, her body still warm from the wine, the laughter, and the flicker of something else she couldn't quite name. Eli was close. Not too close to be inappropriate, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his arm. Mark sat on her other side, his hand gently resting on her lower back, fingers slowly tracing small, unconscious circles through her sweater. It wasn't unusual for Mark to be affectionate, but tonight, his touch felt more intentional, like he was encouraging something. She glanced at him. He was watching her, not possessively, but with a kind of quiet invitation in his eyes, a softness that said, "I see you. I want you to feel." And then he looked past her, toward Eli. The message passed silently, but it was clear. Something had been spoken without a word. Sarah's pulse quickened. Eli leaned forward slightly, his voice low and rough. "You know, I almost didn't come." Mark smiled. "I knew you would." Sarah turned toward Eli, her lips parting slightly. "Why did you?" He didn't answer right away. He studied her instead, his eyes lingering. Not in a way that made her uncomfortable, but in a way that made her feel seen, as if he were acknowledging something about her that had been dormant for a long time. "I guess," he said finally. "I was curious. The word lingered in the air like the smoke curling from the fireplace. Mark's hand moved slowly, almost imperceptibly to her thigh. He squeezed gently. "Sarah," he said softly, "can I ask you something?" She turned to him, breath caught. "Do you trust me?" Her heart pounded in her chest. She nodded. He smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Then let me show you something. Something new. Something just for us." She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Mark stood, then reached for her hand. She let him pull her to her feet. He didn't lead her to the bedroom. He led her to the rug in front of the fire. Eli remained seated on the couch, watching quietly, his expression unreadable. Mark turned to face her, placing both hands on her waist. "You're beautiful, Sarah. Always have been." She felt herself flush, not just from his words, but from the vulnerability in his voice, the reverence. Then, to her surprise, Mark turned and looked at Eli. "You still think she's the most beautiful woman you've ever met?" he asked. Eli didn't hesitate. "I never stopped thinking that." Sarah inhaled sharply. Mark's hands slid to her lower back, guiding her closer, gently. "We've been married a long time," he whispered. "And there are still parts of you I want to help you explore. I want to give you this, if you want it too." He looked into her eyes, not pushing, not expecting, just offering. And in that moment, Sarah knew this wasn't about being wild or reckless. This was about being alive. She nodded once. Eli stood slowly, his movements measured, careful. He stepped forward into the firelight. His eyes never left hers. And then it began, not with urgency, but with tenderness, with hands that asked before they touched, with lips that lingered instead of rushed. The air grew heavy, not with haste, but with reverence. Three people, bound not by lust alone, but by the kind of trust that takes years to build and only moments to bloom. As the fire crackled behind them and the shadows danced along the cabin walls, Sarah let herself fall into something unexpected, something unspoken, something unforgettable. Not just into the arms of two men who loved her in their own way, but into a version of herself she hadn't met in years. The firelight flickered low, casting golden shadows across the cabin floor as Sarah stood between them, barefoot, trembling, utterly alive. Mark's hands were the first to move, slow and deliberate, slipping beneath the hem of her sweater and drawing it upward, exposing her skin to the fire's warmth. His lips followed, pressing soft, lingering kisses along her belly, then upward between her breasts, before pulling the sweater off completely. Eli stood nearby watching, but not passively. He was present, fully, reverently, his eyes moving across her body with something far deeper than hunger. Admiration, desire, restraint. God, he murmured almost to himself. You're stunning. Sarah's breath hitched, the way he said it, low, honest, almost in awe. It made her feel not just beautiful, but worshipped. Mark knelt behind her now, hands sliding down her hips, gently tugging at the waistband of her leggings. She raised her arms slightly, letting him undress her, as if they were performing a ritual instead of just removing clothes. When the fabric slipped from her legs, she stepped out, standing in nothing but her lace underwear, her body soft, mature, real, and yet she had never felt more powerful. Eli stepped closer. He paused, eyes meeting hers, silently asking. Sarah nodded slowly. With one hand, he cupped her face, tilting it gently as he kissed her, deep and warm, with none of the awkwardness of a first kiss. It was tender, exploratory, felt, his lips asking questions her body was already answering. Mark watched, his hands moving up her spine as he whispered in her ear, "You're safe. You're mine. But tonight, you're also ours." Sarah shivered, and then her bra was unclasped, sliding from her shoulders like silk in the firelight. Eli let out a quiet breath. Jesus. Mark kissed her shoulder, then trailed his lips lower. Eli's hands explored her waist, tracing the lines of her hips, as if learning a language he'd always wanted to speak. And when his mouth followed, kissing her collarbone, her neck, the curve beneath her jaw, Sarah closed her eyes, lost in a flood of sensation. It was overwhelming. 2 sets of hands, 2 mouths, 2 men who knew her body as something to cherish, not consume. They moved together like instinct, guiding her gently to the rug in front of the fire. Pillows were pulled down. The wine was forgotten. She lay back as Mark slid her panties off slowly, kissing her thighs as he went, his touch reverent. Eli moved to her side, his fingers trailing across her ribs, between her breasts, until he was kissing her again, this time deeper, darker, his hand slipping between her legs with the kind of confidence that comes from being invited. Sarah moaned, soft, real, unrestrained. Mark looked up from between her thighs, grinning. That sound. I've missed that. She gasped as his tongue found her. Slow circles, then deeper strokes, while Eli's mouth was on her nipple, sucking gently, fingers tangled in her hair. Her hips lifted, her back arched, her body no longer her own. Time disappeared. They didn't rush. They didn't compete. They gave. Again and again. Mark inside her while Eli kissed her lips. Eli behind her while Mark held her hand. Bodies tangled in sweat, heat, firelight, and trust. She cried out more than once, not from pain, but from the kind of pleasure that tears through you like a storm. And when it was over, when her body had been pushed to its edge and brought back again, she lay between them, breathless, limbs intertwined, utterly spent. No one spoke for a long time. There was no need. Eli stroked her hair. Mark kissed her forehead. Sarah closed her eyes, smiling faintly. Whatever tomorrow brought, whatever questions might come, tonight she had been worshipped, adored, known. Not just by her husband, not just by his friend, but by herself. The next morning came slowly. Sarah stirred between warm bodies and softer light. The fire now only embers. Her muscles ached in the most delicious way. Mark was already awake, lying behind her with one arm draped possessively over her waist, his breath steady against her neck. Eli was in front, still asleep, his bare chest rising and falling, hand loosely resting on her thigh. She smiled. She had never felt more desired, more alive. Carefully, she slipped out from between them and padded into the kitchen. She wore nothing but Mark's button-down shirt, slightly wrinkled, hanging open just enough to tease. The cold wood floor sent shivers up her legs, and she grinned at the echo of soreness between her thighs. A good kind of sore. She poured herself coffee, sipped slowly, then turned as Mark appeared in the doorway, shirtless, his jeans riding low on his hips. "You look like sin," he murmured. She raised a brow. "I feel like it too." He walked to her, slid a hand under the hem of the shirt, and cupped her bare bottom. "Last night was just the beginning." Her breath caught. "You think I can handle more?" He leaned in, kissed her collarbone. "I know you can." Behind them, a voice, gravelly and amused, broke the tension. "Am I interrupting something?" Eli stood in the doorway, towel slung over one shoulder, clearly fresh from a shower, and very clearly naked beneath. Sarah turned, unabashed. Only the best kind of interruption. Mark chuckled and pulled her in tighter. "Actually," he said, "I was thinking it's your turn to take charge." Sarah blinked. "Mine?" He nodded, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "You've let us lead. Now we want you to do what you want, whatever that is." She looked between them. Two strong, gorgeous men, her husband and his best friend, both giving her the power. Her skin tingled. Something bold and playful stirred inside her. "Strip," she said suddenly, voice low and commanding, eyes fixed on Eli. He raised a brow, smirking. "Yes, ma'am." And just like that, the tone shifted. Mark stepped back, arms folded, content to watch. Sarah slowly walked toward Eli, eyes never leaving his as she untied the towel from his waist. It dropped to the floor, and she took a long, slow breath as her eyes roamed his body. She kissed him, rougher this time, her hand wrapping around him as she pushed him back against the wall. Eli groaned into her mouth. "Don't move," she whispered. "Let me play." Her lips traced down his chest, her hands greedy now. She dropped to her knees, on her own terms, and took him into her mouth, slowly, deliberately, never breaking eye contact. She felt the power in that gaze, felt his restraint. Behind her, Mark groaned. She didn't even have to look to know he was already hard. But this moment was hers. She teased Eli to the edge, then stopped, standing back up, wiping her lips with the back of her hand as she smirked. "My turn," she said, grabbing Mark's hand and leading them both back to the living room. They obeyed. She sat on the couch, legs parted, commanding, "Undress each other." They hesitated, then smiled. Mark reached for Eli's waistband. Eli helped him. Shirts fell, jeans dropped. The two men stripped each other bare while she watched, sipping coffee like a queen on her throne. She felt drunk on power, on lust, on the way they looked at her like she was their shared obsession. And then she let them worship her again. This time, she guided the rhythm. She climbed onto Mark, straddling him as Eli stood behind her, kissing her neck, fingers exploring her body like sacred ground. Every moan from her lips was an order, every arch of her back a command. They followed. And when she came, loud, wild, body trembling, she didn't hold back. Neither did they. It was pure fire. And when it ended, they collapsed together on the rug, tangled in sweat, breathless and grinning. Sarah laughed, chest rising and falling. "I could get used to this kind of getaway," she whispered. Mark kissed her shoulder. That was the idea. Eli chuckled. We may never go back to regular life again. And in that cabin, far from rules and labels, the three of them drifted into a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. By nightfall, the cabin was once again wrapped in shadows and candlelight. But something had changed. The forest hadn't just awakened their bodies. It had unlocked something darker, hungrier, the kind of desire that demanded more. Not just touch, but full surrender. They had eaten dinner half naked, feeding each other with fingers and teasing lips. Every brush of skin, every accidental graze of thigh or mouth was an invitation left unanswered. On purpose, tension bloomed like wildfire. Sarah felt it in her chest, in her core. That ache that said, take me, all of me, push me further. And they did. She stood by the fireplace, wrapped only in a thin, black robe. Mark and Eli sat on the couch, watching her like predators, waiting for permission to pounce. Take off your clothes, she said simply, voice low but firm. They obeyed. God, the sight of them. Two strong men, naked, aroused, eyes burning for her, was enough to make her legs shake. She walked over, straddled Eli first, her mouth hot on his, as she rocked against him slowly, teasingly. Mark came behind her, fingers sliding into her wetness, stroking her as she moved on Eli's lap. Then came the shift. Mark whispered, "Let go, Sarah. Let us have all of you." She looked back at him, then at Eli, and then she surrendered. She was flipped, lifted, stretched, placed on her hands and knees on the thick rug. Mark entered her from behind while Eli stood in front, guiding her mouth to him, letting her taste his arousal. She gasped, moaned, cried out, mouth full, body full, heart racing. They moved as one. No hesitation, no shame, just heat and friction and raw, glorious abandon. Mark's thrusts were deeper now, harder, sending waves of pleasure up her spine. Eli gripped her hair gently, guiding her movements as her tongue drove him wild. Every inch of her body was used, adored, consumed by them both. She came hard, twice, before collapsing, only to be picked up again, carried to the couch, legs spread as they took turns exploring her body like it was holy ground. And when they finally finished, all three, gasping, trembling, spent, it wasn't over. Mark kissed her lips, long and soft. Eli kissed her chest, his head resting just above her heart. And they held her, one on each side, wrapped in warmth and worship. No more words, just breathing, just presence, just them. Morning came quietly. No birdsong, no breeze, just the soft creak of wood, the warmth of skin, and the slow, rhythmic breathing of three bodies still tangled beneath a shared blanket on the living room floor. Sarah opened her eyes first. Mark was behind her, his hand resting protectively over her waist. Eli lay facing her, his fingers still gently touching the curve of her hip, as if he hadn't let go of her even in sleep. She smiled, not the kind of smile that fades, but the kind that comes from deep satisfaction, the kind that whispers, "I've lived." What had started as a birthday getaway, or a break from routine, had become something else entirely, something primal, intimate, healing. It was never about just sex. It was about permission to feel, to explore, to surrender, to take up space not just as a wife or a woman, but as a whole being, deserving of pleasure without apology. And the most beautiful part? There was no shame, no guilt, only gratitude. She slowly sat up, stretching, every inch of her body humming with the afterglow of a night, a weekend that had rewritten the rules of love, trust, and desire. Mark stirred, pressing a kiss between her shoulder blades. "You okay?" She turned, eyes shining. "I've never been more okay." Eli sat up too, running a hand through his tousled hair. "I think we may have ruined you for ordinary life." She laughed, a soft, sultry laugh that made both men smile. "Good," she whispered. They had breakfast wrapped in robes, fresh fruit, eggs, coffee, and kisses between bites. The kind of morning you never wanted to end. But as they sat outside on the deck overlooking the Pine Valley below, something deeper settled into the quiet between them. Sarah turned to them, eyes steady. "Whatever happens after this, I want you both to know something." Mark and Eli looked at her attentive. "I've spent years doing what was expected, living quietly, safely. But this weekend, you two gave me something I didn't know I was missing. Not just passion, but the reminder that I'm still allowed to feel this alive." Eli reached for her hand. Mark kissed her cheek. They didn't make promises. They didn't define anything. But they didn't need to. Because something sacred had happened here. Something more real than labels. And in her heart, Sarah knew. This was only the beginning. In life, we're told to follow rules, to love safely, to age quietly. But what if there's more waiting for us, just beyond comfort? This story wasn't just about desire. It was about permission. Permission to explore, to crave, to be seen and worshipped even after the world thinks your fire should dim. If you're listening to this and feeling something stir inside you, that ache, that thrill, don't ignore it. You deserve pleasure. You deserve intimacy that touches your soul, not just your skin. And if you're looking for more stories like this, you've found the right place. Subscribe now. More bold, beautiful stories are waiting for you. Because here, we don't apologize for desire. We celebrate it.